Hello, this is John from caveofprogramming.com, and in this tutorial we're going to look at the application lifecycle. Sorry, that should be the activity lifecycle in Android. So if you go to Google and you search for Android activity lifecycle, you'll find this page from developer.android.com, which has a really nice diagram in it if you scroll down a bit. And after you've installed your activity, it's of course not necessarily running, and activities in Android, they tend to stay running for a long time in the background after you've started them. So when you start your application, what happens is the onCreate method is called, and we've been overriding our onCreate method to do kind of our setup in the application. We call super.onCreate, which is very important. And then we kind of set up the application's layout and anything else that we need to set up to initially run the application. And that all happens in the overridden onCreate method. Now after onCreate, onStart is called, and then onResume, and then the activity is running in the foreground. And if your activity is shut down, and it could be shut down by, for example, if you've stopped your application, you've gone to another application altogether, and memory gets low, Android might decide to actually shut down your application rather than to leave it running in the background. And when that happens, onPause is called, then onStop, then onDestroy. So all these methods are called in sequence. But now it can also happen that if let's say your activity is running and a dialog comes up, a system dialog, so your activity is still visible but it's no longer in the foreground, then your application, your activity will enter the onPause state, and your activity's onPause method will be called. So we'll go to here in the diagram, and after onPause there are two things that could happen. One is that your application could end up being stopped and then destroyed, for example, because onPause is just one step on the way towards closing down the application. But most often the user will probably go back to your application, or at least I say most often, certainly this is a frequent possibility. And if the user returns to your application and the application is brought back into the foreground, then onResume will be called and the activity will be running again. Similarly, if your application's stopped, if you go to another application completely so that your activity is no longer even visible in the background, it will be stopped. So it's still kind of hanging around in the background in a stop state, but it's not destroyed, it's still loaded into memory. And in that case, after onStop, either it can happen that your application will be started again because the user goes back to it, in which case onRestart is called, then onStart is called again, and then onResume, and then your activity is running again. But it could also happen that the activity will be closed down by Android to reclaim the memory, for example, in which case onDestroy will be called and the activity will be shut down. So a quick summary is that first of all, it's important to realize that these methods are always called in sequence. If onCreate is called, then let's say if onCreate is called, then the next step will be onStart and onResume before the activity is running. And similarly, if the activity is shut down, first onPause will be called, then onStop, then onDestroy. And if your application is no longer in the foreground but still running, it will enter the pause state, so onPause will be called, and before it can unpause and get into the foreground again, onResume will be called. And if your application is not even visible, so it's the user's using another application altogether, or another activity I should really say, then the activity will be stopped. It will enter the onStop state, and it will go through onPause first, then onStop, and from onStop the application can either be restarted, in which case onRestart and onStart is called, and then onResume, and then it's running, or it could be destroyed this way. So when you first encounter this, I think it seems quite complex, but it's actually really simple once you get your head around it and you can remember which methods are involved. And we've already looked at the onCreate method here. We've used that to set our application up. And here we're going to make use, in this tutorial, we're going to make use of onPause, because onPause, as I say, it's used whenever your activity goes out, recedes from the foreground. So if some system dialog comes up, onPause will be called, but it's also called before your application is destroyed. And this means that onPause is a pretty good place to save your data, because it will happen, you can expect it to happen during the kind of life of the activity, and it will always happen before the activity is destroyed. So in onPause, if you've got some data to save, and as long as it doesn't take more than a brief amount of time, most a second or two, to save that data, you can do it in onPause. And if your activity has to save a lot of data, then don't try to do it in onPause, because your application may get stopped or destroyed before it can complete. If your application has to save a lot of data, you need to be saving it as you go along while your activity is actually running. Now in my my Note Squirrel application, let's see, here's my emulator, and I just want to close down this keyboard here by touching my phone. I've got this text that the user can type here, and I've got a save button to save the text, and I've rearranged my application just a little bit so that the text is saved in a method called save text. So if we go to my main activity, which presents this screen here, then I've given it a, where are we, a save text method. Yeah, it's down here, the main activity, and here's save text, and this saves the text in response to the save button being clicked here. But I could also add this to onPause. So let's right click here and go to source, override implement methods, and I'm going to look for onPause in here, override this, and I'm going to leave super on pause in there. It's really important that that should stay there, but I'm going to add save text in here and just save that. And now my application will try to save its text whenever it goes into pause mode, which could be because the application is being shut down, or it could just be that it's no longer in the foreground because some dialogue has come up. And it could also be because it's being stopped because the user is changing to another program. You see, if the application is stopped, it will first go through onPause. Okay, so that's it for this tutorial, and we're going to move on soon, I think, to actually deploying this application, to actually publishing it, in fact. So join me again next time, and until next time, happy coding.